To my melanated family and spiritually conscious brothers and sisters around the world, I am Brother Tommy. It's time to get it in. This video, we are going to talk about the collapse of the US dollar. The entire world is talking about what is going on and what they are going to do, but nobody's talking about what Black Americans specifically are going to do. The indigenous people of this land, how are we going to make our family strong and make it through the collapse of the dollar so that we continue to move forward as a people? This video is going to go over what is going on in terms of what is going on in the current media in terms of the collapse of the dollar. And we're also going to talk about what Black Americans should be focused on so that we can have what we need to make it through any situation and flourish on the national stage as a group of people separate from the United States of America, the corporation. And to bring it home, Dr. Henrik Clarke, the master teacher, is going to talk to us about how unity amongst us as a people is a must. We don't have to think 100% alike. We don't have to see everything the same way, but we do have to have a unity. We can create an economic base, a cultural base in which we can do business amongst each other so that we all cannot depend on certain other nations and be able to feed our families and our nations. So let's get it in. Let's check out what's going on when it comes to the collapse of the US dollar and how we should proceed as a people.
For decades, world trade has been dominated by the dollar.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world.
The SWIFT system, that actually became weaponized by the U.S.
The Monetary Authority of Singapore and the People's Bank of China have renewed the bilateral currency swap arrangement.
Saudi Arabia is in discussions with China to price some of its oil sales in yuan.
But as ties with Washington continue to be strained, Beijing and Moscow are diversifying.
China and Russia had taken another step closer towards dumping the dollar and agreed to trade in their respective national currencies, the Russian ruble and the Chinese.
And it is 1944, there was something called Bretton Woods, and that's where the U.S. dollar was tied to gold. In other words, the value of the U.S. dollar was connected to the value of gold. And between Fort Knox and other areas, we had gold reserves. So the U.S. currency on a global scale was deemed as being valuable, tied to gold, and stable. And in 1944, everyone came to this agreement to say, hey, let's peg the value of our currency to the dollar because the dollar is pegged to gold, and it brought international global stability. It also created the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Well, what does that mean? That means if you have extra reserves and you bought them in dollars, they were stable because they were tied to the gold. Now, Nixon, and we can talk about what you just referenced a minute ago, was Nixon taking us off the gold standard 72, 73, which had nothing to do with the Vietnam War and political instability in the economy at that time.
I agree.
It was deeper.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
It was deeper reasons. That was the front excuse.
He's making a really good point there, family. There were a lot of deeper reasons why the dollar was unpegged from the gold, and I'm pretty sure you can see what it was. It's so that they can print as much funny money as possible. They knew they had the printing press and the military to back it up, so therefore they just went to printing dollars. That's why the devaluation of the dollar began. So there's a lot of context to what he's saying that they're not speaking about, that they seem to put forth information that they understand. This is when debt dollarization basically started, is when they unpegged the dollar from the gold. From there on, it was going to be funny money.
Excuse. Right now, you know what the average is right now on world reserves? 62% of countries' reserves are held in U.S. dollars. 62% right now. And so even though we went off the gold standard, we're the reserve currency. So people see the United States currency as very stable. That's what's important. And what we're seeing here is the yuan. Everybody hears the yuan. Well, that's a unit of measure. The actual currency in China is called the renminbi. That's their dollar. Dollar equals renminbi. Yuan is like a unit. And so what they want is they want to slowly, remember, China plays a long game. They want to slowly replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency. Because,
will they succeed?
Huh?
Will they succeed?
Well, they're taking one step at a time, and they're starting with African nations that they put into, by the way, you can also go study mercantilism, where you come in and you take all the resources and then you sell them back things that are made out of the resources. So China is in an active state right now of assisting many small regional Latin American and African nations on deals that are intentionally going to go bad and then leave them with the collateralization of the country they've just pillaged. And so long term, if somebody doesn't stand up long term, sure, China could be successful because they're playing this not the way the West plays it. The West has played the game in terms of history, in terms of regimes, a regime of leadership. China is playing this long term in terms of decades.
Dynasties.
I don't know about that. They're definitely and creating international relationships and financing big deals across the board on the international scene. China is, but are they looking for these loans to go bad in a nefarious way as Europeans would? I don't know about that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't mean to interrupt. I agree. I think the dollar, it's gonna hit a flat line because Germany, South Korea, and Japan are not going to drop the dollar as the world reserve currency, and especially Germany and Japan. They produce a lot of value and a lot of wealth, and so the euro backstopping the world reserve currency, meaning the dollar being the backstop of the euro, is actually in our benefit. But India is going to be the big question, right? If India falls, that's a growing market.
Yep.
Brazil is a totally corrupt country. They're a broken country. The bulls on Brazil have been wrong the last 20 years. It's like $1 trillion GDP. You could fact check me on it. They're mainly a natural resource hub, and they have a real hard time with their own homegrown industry, and there was like 1.6 trillion. I was about right. It's actually flatlined and gone down in recent years. So the bulls on Brazil have been wrong, and with Lula now becoming president, they're going to become a wholly owned colony of the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, that's what Brazil.
Catastrophic for the nation.
It's
by
terrible.
The way. Yeah.
No, the future of Brazil is put in permanent jeopardy because of Bolsonaro not staying as president, prime minister.
And everybody thought BRIC through the 90s was just an acronym for emerging nations.
Yes.
Brazil, Russia, India, China. It wasn't. It was a coalition over there that wanted to undermine U.S. authority on a global trade basis.
You can always catch a white supremacist in action. Undermine their authority. What authority is that? You see how they view the world from them being in a dominant position.
You can say that it wasn't a good idea for us to become the world reserve currency. However, it's a fact that if we stop being the world reserve currency, every single person in America gets significantly poor overnight. The fact that people have to turn their goods and services into dollars is kind of a stimulus boost.
Listen what he just said, family. If the dollar is removed as the world reserve currency, then people get poor overnight. So they're looking at poor from the standpoint of the United States as a country, as a corporation, in relationship to other white countries. Never once are they looking at it in terms of what are black people going to do or so-called black people are going to do. We need to start thinking. It should be alarming to us that if the dollar is no longer the world reserve currency and the standard of living is going to change overnight, and they say when white folks get a cold, black folks get the flu. So we should be thinking about what are we going to do to survive. It's not as if it's like when we were younger, or back in the heyday and people lived on lands in the 50s, 30s, or 40s or during the Great Depression. We were able to make it through that because we wasn't ushered into all these big cities and we grew our own food. We lived off of the land. Things were totally different. What are black people going to do now when we don't produce cars? We don't produce food of our own, clothing, the large amount of shelter that we need. If the dollar collapses, what are we as a people going to do?
I mean, India's a tricky country. You can't trust their government. They're doing deals with Iran and they're doing all sorts of weird stuff for energy. But India should be the most natural partner and hedge. You could squeeze China through a bilateral agreement with Korea, Japan, and India. And that's why America needs to be actively involved in the room and calling balls and strikes, using sanctions and tariffs where necessary, and using the global reserve currency status to be able to effectuate meaningful geopolitical change, which we do not have right now. I disagree a little bit.
Which is the exact reason why the BRIC nations are coming together to get rid of this European overlord from exactly what you said. All they look to do is seek to dominate, and he's making it obvious.
So the question is, how can China and Russia together kill the dominance of the dollar, and what exactly is their strategy? Well, the first thing we need to understand is that leverage is one of the most powerful tools in geopolitics. In this case, Russia is one of the largest oil and gas producers in the world. So although Saudi and other countries were selling oil and gas in dollars, Russia punished its unfriendly countries by asking them to buy Russian oil in rubles. So by default, most of the European countries had to buy ruble in spite of they hating Putin for it. Which means what? In the payment network diagram, instead of US bank having dollar reserves, all the unfriendly countries that bought oil from Russia now had to keep their money in Russian central bank. So just like dollar reserves helped the US economy, the ruble reserves are expected to compromise for the damage to the Russian economy. Which means, just like petrodollar, we are seeing the rise of petro-ruble. And if you look at Russia's dollar reserves, they have been preparing to get rid of the dollar since 2014 itself. And if you see this graph, the US treasuries have gone down from $150 billion in 2013 to just $3.98 billion as of 2021. This is the leverage that Russia has over Europe. Similarly, China has its leverage with the Belt and Road Initiative countries. And if you remember from our BRI episode, China's Belt and Road Initiative is a $3 trillion project whereby the Chinese have given out over-generous loans to countries all across the world. And you know what? Under the BRI initiative, in total, there are 165 countries in the world who owe a collective debt of $385 billion to China. And many of these countries have taken so much debt from China that they cannot afford to pay it back to China. And we saw this very, very clearly with both Pakistan and Sri Lanka, right? And this is where China's strategic move comes in. And now that China has a leverage over these countries, experts say that China would now ask these countries to take and pay back loans in yuan. And in exchange, China could incentivize the scheme by giving them a 1% discount on their interest. Now, do you realize if Pakistan owes $24.7 billion in debt to China, considering its economic crisis right now, a 1% discount on a $24.7 billion in debt is a big deal for Pakistan. In fact, since the inception of the BRI initiative, China has already issued 14% of all its loans in its own currency without depending on the dollar. And guess what? In 2018, the Central Bank of Pakistan had already agreed to conduct their bilateral trade with China in yuan. And even other countries like Myanmar, Cambodia and Russia are doing the same now. On top of that, China is now the largest trade partner with 25 BRI participating countries. So again, the leverage of trade for China is very strong. So you see, with the combination of both trade and debt, China could pressurize these countries to use yuan over the dollar. So this way, over time, China could pull the strings of 165 nations and could drastically increase the circulation of yuan. Now the question over here is, all these countries are mostly poor countries, right? So how would China and Russia get rich countries like England and South Korea to skip the dollar? Well, firstly, Russia is strongly supporting China and has already turned the Chinese yuan into their reserve currency. So this is a major move. And as far as other countries are concerned, they have something called bilateral currency swap agreement. And this is something that even India is pursuing very strategically with its ally countries. So the question is, what is the bilateral currency swap agreement and how does it actually work in international trade? As usual, let's try to understand this using a story. Let's say China and UK sign a bilateral currency swap agreement of 5 years for a value of $1 million. What this means is that China will sell $1 million worth of yuan to UK and UK will sell $1 million worth of pounds to China. So after conversion, China will give 6.842 million yuan to UK and UK will give China 847,250 pounds. And they will agree upon the exchange rate to be 8.07. So for 5 years, Chinese central bank can sell these pounds and get US dollars, or it can lend these pounds to domestic bank and companies to settle their trade. Similarly, the Bank of England can do the same with yuan. So now, if an English businessman wants to buy 1 million yuan worth of goods from China, if he went by the conventional means, what would he have to do? He would have to pay in pounds to the English bank, which will then convert the sum to dollars, then transfer the dollars to the US bank account of China, and then the Chinese bank will transfer the converted sum of yuan to the Chinese businessman. This will incur both a lot of time and a lot of cost. But now, the English businessman would simply borrow 1 million yuan from the Bank of England and directly pay the Chinese bank account in England. And as soon as this money is transferred in the Chinese bank account in England, the Chinese bank in China would transfer 1 million yuan to the Chinese businessman. And the same thing could be done vice versa when a Chinese businessman wants to buy something from UK. So if you see, two big players can now do international trade without depending on the US dollar. This is how the currency swap agreement works. And after 5 years, both the central banks of UK and China will pay their respective currencies back at the agreed exchange rate of 8.07. So this way, both countries get three major advantages. Number one, both countries can eliminate their exchange risk. Number two, both countries can use this currency to exchange it for dollars if needed. And thirdly, businesses in both countries can carry out trade more economically. So the business relationship between both the countries gets better and better with time. And last and most importantly, the dependency on US dollar decreases by a large extent. And guess what? Beijing has signed more than 3 trillion yuan worth of bilateral currency swap deals with more than 40 countries across the world. And this includes 400 billion yuan each with Hong Kong and South Korea, 350 billion yuan each with Bank of England and the European Central Bank, 300 billion yuan with Singapore and 150 billion yuan with Russia. And cherry on the cake, since China is the world's largest manufacturer with almost 20% of the entire world's manufacturing happening in China, they could further leverage this in order to push the companies to pay in yuan instead of the US dollars. And guess what? Now Saudi Arabia is considering selling oil in yuan, which means if Saudi Arabia starts selling oil in yuan, a lot of countries would rush to buy yuan. And again, like we saw in the case with excess forex being invested in US bonds, the excess yuan would then be invested in Chinese bonds, making the Chinese economy more and more powerful. This is how China and Russia are slowly building their currency strategies to overthrow the reserve currency throne from the US dollar.
They do their very best to downplay in the media what's going on in China, or that Russia and China is meeting, other countries that are interested in doing the same thing. You see very little of these things going on, only speaking to how horrible Russia's economy is doing and how bad they are losing the war. Just putting all this propaganda out here so the American people really don't see what's going on. But we as a melanated people need to have some foresight. We need to look ahead and see that they're truly connecting and they're making this thing move. And they're talking with African countries that have economies, but African countries that have not once sent a ship over here to America to pick up black folk after their independence. So what is black Americans going to do in terms of our local economies? How are we going to exchange goods and services with each other, create loans and finances amongst each other to where we can manufacture goods? What are we going to do to survive and to push our people forward on this land?
This week, Russia is increasingly turning to China's yuan as its foreign currency of choice. And Moscow supports the use of the yuan in trade with other countries. Could that threaten the US dollar? So, since being shut out of much of the global financial system, Russia has sought alternatives to soften the impact of Western sanctions. It's turned to China for an economic lifeline, and trade between the two countries hit a record of $190 billion last year. Much of those payments were made in Chinese and Russian currencies. The two biggest geopolitical rivals of the US want to counterbalance the dominance of the dollar worldwide, and Russia is increasingly embracing the yuan. Even before the war, Russia's central bank tried reducing the country's dependence on Western currencies, but the invasion has further accelerated those efforts. In the third quarter of 2022, foreign currency in the Russian banking system fell to an all-time low of 15%. And in the past year, the share of the dollar and the euro transactions on the Russian market has declined. Meanwhile, the yuan overtook the US dollar as the most traded currency on the Moscow exchange last month, with a market share of close to 40% of trading volume. Well, Russia's president is making an effort to get other countries to pay for trade in Chinese currency. After his meeting with the Chinese president Xi Jinping in Moscow more than a week ago, Vladimir Putin said, "We support the use of Chinese yuan in payments between Russia and countries of Asia, Africa and Latin America." The Russian leader also expressed confidence that such forms of payment will be developed between Russian partners and their colleagues in third countries. The meeting between Xi and Putin was meant to cement their no-limits partnership, which was announced last year. And the two leaders have agreed to expand their economic ties. China is already a major buyer of discounted Russian oil and gas. Its imports of Russian coal have surged 20% to more than 68 million tons. Russia has also been ramping up imports of Chinese goods, including machinery, electronics, base metals, vehicles, ships, and aircraft. Well, the US dollar has dominated global trade and capital flows for decades, but its share in global central bank reserves, it's dropped to less than 60% from roughly 70% 20 years ago. The euro's share has gone up slightly since its launch more than 2 decades ago, from 18% to just under 20%. And while the yuan is being widely used, it constitutes less than 3% of global currency reserves. And China's attempts to expand the currency's international role has faced roadblocks.
Thank you for speaking with us, Doctor. Every year, the U.S. publish, human rights record on every country but itself. What do you make of that? Some people accuse the U.S. of using the so-called human rights to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, in particular the countries they are not happy with or they see as rivals. What do you make of that?
The pious arm of human rights that the USA waves all the time is hypocritical. This is the country that has invaded other countries, killing so many people, including children. This is the country that has appropriated the resources of other countries, leaving those countries helpless. Look at Iraq today.
20th anniversary of...
20th anniversary. What is happening to the Iraqi oil money? When Iraq sells oil, all the money goes to the USA. It's the USA government that decides how much to give to the Iraqi government to use. The Iraqi government has to submit a budget to the USA to get its own money after 20 years of that conflict. Is Iraq independent? Is Iraq sovereign? Iraq today is a colony of the USA. This is the country that occupies other countries' territories. For how long have they been in Guantanamo, on Cuban soil? A small island, the whole country of the USA, a huge territory, they still go and grab a small territory, not very far away from its own country, from its own coast. They have been occupying it for how many years?
Several decades.
The Cubans have been crying, give us our land. The USA does not respect the territory. Can really the USA claim Guantanamo to be their territory?
Right.
You can understand the same behavior in Taiwan. Same behavior. If today China or Russia went and did the same in Hawaii, what the USA is doing with Taiwan, would the USA accept it? They say, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. Does the USA do unto others as it would like them to do on itself?
This is an interesting perspective of the point here. You mentioned about the equality among sovereign nations. That's an exercise of democracy, based on equal footing and expressing one's wish or one's needs or demands equally in the international community. Do you think there's enough democracy in terms of that respect?
If you don't respect the territories of other people, those territories are occupied by human beings. How can you respect human beings when you don't respect the territories which they occupy? How can you respect a human being when you don't respect the privacy of their home, the dignity of their home? A homeland is something very important to any human being. Every human being on this planet has a homeland. The homeland is their house, it's their home. That's why it's called homeland. You don't just get into somebody's house. You don't just get into somebody's country and interfere. If you don't respect the sovereignty of a territory, you cannot respect the human being who lives in that territory. You cannot claim to be committed to their democratic rights. You cannot claim to be committed to their human rights. What are human rights without a homeland? What are human rights or democracy without sovereignty? When your rights can be trampled on, when your leaders can be toppled anytime, when your leaders can be killed anytime. Look at what they did to Saddam Hussein. Look what they did to Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. Look at what they do to other people's leaders. Look even at the attitude, the arrogance towards other people. They never respect the leaders of other countries. We have 20 years. Iraq today is ungovernable. It's a failed state. Since the murder of Muammar Gaddafi, is Libya today more democratic since 2011? Is Libya today more organized? Is Libya today more stable? It's a failed state. Wherever they have been, there are problems. Have they brought peace and stability and democracy and respect for human rights to Syria? Without the intervention of the Russians, where would Syria be today? They would have overrun that people. How many countries has the USA toppled? How many coup d'etats have they carried out? How many assassinations of leaders of other countries have they carried out? How many citizens of other countries have they killed? How many citizens of other countries have they arrested and detained and released without charges?
Well, in addition to the lack of respect for sovereignty or abuse of human rights, what about the record of the human rights record inside the USA?
Look at the treatment of black people.
George Floyd?
Yes. And when did black people start voting in America? The USA became independent in 1776. When did black people who were taken there against their will, when were they given the right to vote? It's not very long ago. Can you claim equal rights for black people in America? Go to American jails today. The majority of the inmates are black people. In a country where the blacks are a minority, but in prison they're the majority. Why? Are black people generally bad people? Is there something that can be done about that?
It's more than a human rights issue, it's a racism.
Yes, they're racist. Part of the hatred for China is racism. They cannot accept that a country that is non-white can surpass them economically and in so many areas of human achievements, of human endeavor. They can't accept that. But it is happening. When people go to vote, who do they vote for? Do they vote for themselves? Do they vote for other people? When it comes to other rights like access to clean water, access to food, who do they feed? Do they feed themselves? Do they put water in their own mouths or in the other person's mouths? They care about voting because those poor people do not vote for themselves, they vote for them. They don't set a political agenda for themselves, they follow an agenda set for them. When it comes to the things that really matter, to food, to water and other things, it's about those individuals. So they don't care about those individuals. When a black person votes in America, who is he voting for? When a black person is eating in America, who is he eating for? In whose mouth does he put food? He's not putting food in Biden's mouth, but when it comes to vote, he's voting for Biden. So the vote matters because it's going to Biden. The food doesn't matter because it's going into that poor black person's mouth.
Globally, obviously there are differences in terms of democracy, but then if you look at, for example, the United States in 2021, they hosted the first democracy summit, and they do it again at the end of March, obviously. So some people say the US is attempting to use democracy as a tool, if not a weapon, to divide the world, to advance their, let's say, geostrategy, to contain the rise of China. They divide the world as democracy versus autocracy, and labeling countries as autocracy, authoritarian instead of democratic ones. How do you make of that?
They don't hide their intentions. That's a goodness with them. They say it very clearly. It's either you are with us or not with us. What does it mean to be with them? To be with them means to do their will, to live according to their will, to their dictates. When they say jump, you jump, then you're with them. If you don't, you are not with them. These summits are there to divide the world between those who they call dictatorships, who are not with them, and those who they call democracies, who are with them. If you are with them, you are not a dictator, even if you are one. We have seen this in Africa. We had Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo. For how long did they sustain him? Mobutu had no elections. Mobutu squandered the resources of his country. He was still there dying. It didn't matter. They had the apartheid regime in South Africa. They were their friends. Was apartheid South Africa democratic? They had the white minority racist regime in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. They were their friends, they supported them. Was that a democratic regime? Was there a democratic dispensation in Rhodesia? They supported Pinochet in Chile, who toppled an elected government with their assistance. He was working for them. Did they care that Pinochet killed so many people? Did they try Pinochet for violation of human rights? For mass murders? What did they do with in Indonesia with Suharto? How many communists were killed? Almost 2 million communists killed in Indonesia. Have the Americans raised the banner of human rights? Has anybody been arrested for genocide? No. How many people did they kill in Vietnam? How many? Has anyone been tried for the murders in Vietnam?
But then...
Okay, family, that's an example of what's going on the world stage and how other nations are connecting and working together to bring about this foot that is on their neck, basically get this foot off their neck. And we as Black Americans need to be thinking the exact same way. So now we're going to turn to what our approach should be, and the main focus of reparations, if we do get that, from this government. We don't need it because we can do it as a people, in my personal opinion. But if we do want that, we need to make sure we get land, a allodial title, land grant, and here's the reason why.
When it comes to understanding financial inequality in this country, economists often point to the absence of African-American generational wealth as one principal factor. It's resources passed from parent to child. As John Yang reports, for many African Americans, one source of the problem goes back decades.
Over the past century, African Americans have lost millions of acres of farms they owned across the South. It's a trend propelled not just by economic forces, but by white racism and local white political and economic power. It's not just a legacy of the Jim Crow South either. Most of the losses have occurred since the 1950s. That history and its lasting effects are the subjects of the cover story of the September issue of The Atlantic magazine. It's written by Van Newkirk, who's a staff writer at the magazine. Van, thanks for joining us tonight. What is important about this story? Why did you want to tell this story, and what is important you think that people should know from it?
Well, right now the country is in the middle of a lot of debates over the racial wealth gap, over the status and economic prosperity or lack thereof of African Americans here, and also about reparations, perhaps. And I wanted to, with this piece, recenter the conversation on the South, on Black folks in the South who often get left out of this conversation, on one of the places where the deficit has been the most extreme, and that's in farming and then the ownership of land.
You call this, or the headline is The Great Land Robbery. What happened? Give us an idea of what happened.
So what happened was pretty much after the middle of the 20th century, federally funded farm programs, they were put out there to give small and middle-sized farmers loans, to support farms, to keep them going through bad economic times. They systematically disenfranchised and also discriminated against Black farmers. So they didn't get the loan amounts, they were denied loans that they were entitled to, and often these local USDA programs were used as bully pulpits or forces to actually push Black farmers off their land.
Amen. That is exactly what I have been saying. Getting reparations in monetary form when they have a crashing dollar. No, we need to get back to the land, get back to our original way. And notice that he also mentioned a land grant. And another word I need to also mention to the family is a allodial title. We need to look deeply into these things so that we can reestablish ourselves on a piece of land. And then we have to create industries where we can create commerce and products where we can have trading partners throughout the world. Because if not, they're going to let Black Americans starve if that be the case.
Off their land.
And some of this was actually accelerated or exacerbated as a result of the civil rights movement, that this was a reaction to the civil rights movement.
Right. So most of the USDA funding was actually leveraged through locally elected boards. And guess who could not vote in the South? So what would happen is these boards were dominated by the segregationists. And if you were a Black farmer who needed money to grow your crops next year, one of the ways they could ensure you never joined the NAACP or never went out to vote or march against segregation was to hold that money in their hand and say, you're not getting this money unless you toe the company line. And so what they did to Black farmers who didn't do that, who did go out and join the NAACP and these organizations, they took their money from them.
The same exact thing that they did to the Black farmers, withholding money from those who wanted to be progressive and move forward and do what they're, what they knew they could do with their talents. It's the exact same thing they're doing with the Black church, with the 501c3, basically putting a piece of tape over their mouth. No political statements, nothing serious. If you want to keep that dollar coming in tax-free, you better make sure you shut up. Doing the exact same thing to the Black church.
Told you.
It's dear to me that my children know what my ancestors went through for us to be where we are and who we are. Because I'm a firm believer that if we don't know our history, then we repeat the mistakes over and over again.
knowing your history. She says that families were denied their history by having their farmland taken away. Talk about that and the other effects of this, the impact it has on families.
Well, I talked to dozens of farm families for this story, and the reason why Walena's particular story and character got to me is because she's a historian. This is in her bones. She wants to build a museum in the Delta to honor not just her father and grandfather, but all the other farmers who came before her. I think she embodies the idea that what we're talking about here is not just money, not just the access to land, but the ability to put down cultural roots, to have a place to call your own. That's history, right? That's a thing that I do not believe we quite understand. It's lost when people are forced to move, when they are denied the ability to own the land under their feet. They are denied a bit of their history. These people who live in the Delta now, black folks who live in the Delta now, they are in this place that was built with their hands and work that they are a part of, but not allowed to actually hold any part of.
You also talk in your story about how a lot of this land, through various transactions, is now held by pension funds, by venture capitalists, by hedge funds. You seem to hint that you think these transactions were somehow unethical?
I believe that it's possible through totally ethical means at this point, so many decades away from the original theft, to receive the land legitimately. You know, if you buy it from somebody who owned it and they don't have the lineage of the land, they don't know where it came from, that's a legal purchase. What I try to make the point of in the piece is that it probably doesn't matter whether an individual company got its land portfolio in a place where predominantly black folks lived and worked and should own the land. It doesn't really matter if they got it individual plots of land ethically or legally. What matters is that at some point, the land was taken unethically and was taken away from these black folks illegally. What is our legal, ethical, moral responsibility as a people to rectify that?
Well, he is sure right about that. We have to do something. We are the legacy that our ancestors left behind. We know that this is our ancient land and our people own this land straight up. And it has been taken away from us and we need to get it back. And since we are the legacy, we have to push for it. Because if we don't go fight for our land back, how else are we going to get it?
Well, I mean, let me ask that. You talked about reparations earlier. How should we be thinking about rectifying this?
I do not believe the current reparations debate, in its well-meaning and well-intended effort to try and quantify every single thing that was done to black people since slavery, that's an amazing effort. And I believe over the last 5 to 10 years, there have been people doing work that folks have not been able to approach in 150 years on quantifying in terms of a dollar amount. I think that approach, though, has lost the focus on land and land ownership and collective land ownership in some ways, and the sentimental and cultural and generational meaning of attachment to a place and having mobility be by choice instead of by being forced out. I think that's a dimension that should be added back to this conversation. Is the original promise of reparations was a land grant. It was 40 acres and a mule. People didn't love it because it had certain monetary value. They loved it because it gave them a place to call home forever. Gave them something to give to their children, not just money, but a sense of belonging, a place they can put their name on. And that's, I do believe the current reparations debate is missing.
My dad's land was taken, and that's how I see it.
Over the course of the entire 20th century, we know that black farmers have lost about 12 million acres of land total.
We are just being forced out. They're trying to force us out.
These cases of dispossession can only be called theft.
Now I'm gonna help them get a poly pipe loaded so they can start putting the poly pipe in.
I've been doing this all of my life. As a kid, we went to the field until it was dark, either cotton chopping or cotton picking.
The Mississippi Delta is this area between these rivers in the northwest of Mississippi that has some of the most fertile land in the United States, in the continent, really. If you go out there, you'll see rows and rows of cotton, of soybeans, every single type of crop you can imagine. But in the early 20th century, almost all the land was owned by white folks. It was homesteaded out by the federal government, or was otherwise inaccessible to black folks.
My grandpapa, Ed Scott Sr., started purchasing land back in 1938. They came from Hale County, Alabama, and they moved to Mississippi in 1919 before my dad was born. My grandmama hated it here, but in Alabama, black people could only sharecrop. No one would sell them land. Very few could get the historic 40 acres and a mule.
Ed Scott Sr. was almost supernaturally gifted at farming. He knows exactly how to rotate the crops, how to plant things in a way that gets the highest yields. And that gave him his own economic gravity that local white businessmen could not ignore. Eventually, a plantation owner decides to sell Ed Scott Sr. a plot of land.
When he passed in 1957, the family had acquired acres and acres of land.
Ed Scott's son, Ed Scott Jr., takes over the farm. He is part of the generation of men that goes off to war during World War II. And when this generation of black men comes back, their white peers are granted so many free things from the GI Bill. They get free education, lots of them get free homes, they get things they can pass on to their children. But the black men among that number are denied many of those opportunities.
My dad went to World War II, and when he came back, his dad wanted him to go and finish school. But farming is in his blood.
You had to know what you're doing to make a living here. You had to. Mom and Dad used to bale hay and sell chicken and turkeys. He used to take turkeys to Greenwood down there, white people, and sell them. My dad was the smartest one of his siblings and the hardest worker of his siblings. You know, every now and then he'll say, God ain't gonna make no more land, so you better hold what you got.
When Ed Scott Jr. takes over the farm, he's operating it through one of the most turbulent times in American history. 1953, the first bus boycotts. 1954, Brown v. Board. 1955, Emmett Till is lynched.
You know, I left here and went to Selma, Alabama when they had the march from Selma to Montgomery. It was rough back then, but you had to have some guts to stand up and just be rough with them.
When he owned his land, he actually had 57 families who lived on his land and worked with him. And it was like a community. Whatever we needed was on our farm. We would put up peaches, we would put up peas and butter beans, and everybody got their share to carry them across the winter. It was like a utopia.
Modern farming requires debt in order to grow your crops, in order to collect a harvest. Over the past 100 years, the federal government has become more and more of a player in providing the credit to those farmers. Much of the administration of this federal money was done by locally elected committees. And what do we know about voting in the South at that time? We know black people could not vote. The people who ended up controlling all that were the great-grandchildren of the plantation owners. And why would they ever give a black farmer money to start his own farm. And so between 1950 and 1969, black farmers lose something on the order of 6 million acres of land across the country. But the Scots were able to hold on to most of their land until the farm crisis of the 1970s and 1980s.
Rising fuel costs, increasing cost of production, new taxes. These changes will have a significant impact on the well-being of family farmers. Federal legislators are slashing farm programs to pay for the deficit.
As farming in America collapses in the 70s and 80s, there's a lifeline in the Mississippi Delta: catfish. The federal government, they pour a whole bunch of money into taking these poor white farmers who are struggling, getting them into catfish. The people who are left out of that are the black farmers. Ed Scott Jr. sees what's happening. He sees catfish as a way out. He converts most of his farms into 8 giant catfish ponds with no help from the federal government. He digs them himself. He builds the very first catfish plant owned and operated by an African American in the United States. And it becomes this inspirational story across the South of a black person who has literally beat all the odds to create something new.
My dad loved clothes, and he loved to dress. Even on a daily basis, he wore what we call khaki suits, which would have been a khaki shirt with matching pants, and they had to be starched and ironed. He always had a nice new car, but he kept it closed up in a shed so no one would know he had it. He did not commingle, meaning white people would call staying in your place. Well, no black's supposed to have a car.
There's gonna come a time when they think you're uppity. And that's exactly what happened to the Scots.
It wasn't just because we were black, it's because we was doing so well in front. We were doing so well.
Blacks were never successful at getting enough money to farm with from USDA. So when they went in to get the money for the crop, they gave them half of what they need, which was the way of keeping blacks from being successful. Because if you're gonna grow beans and you say, I need this much for fertilizer, I need this much for crop protection, I need this much for seeds, and I need this much for watering, and you only get half of that, there's no way for you to produce a good crop.
Yeah, they know you trying to buy no land in Mississippi. You never own no land in Mississippi. White people ain't gonna let you own no land in Mississippi. That's what the county agent will tell me.
It's documented. They did not offer him the same loan terms. They regularly offered him much smaller loans than they did white farmers in the area.
The county agent, he refused to give him a loan. So he could not feed his fish, could not water his crops. They foreclosed on his land.
At its peak, the Scots farm spanned across 1,000 acres. Now it was down to just 300.
Who won it? Black farmers. When? Now!
In 1997, thousands of black farmers sued the USDA for discrimination. What's known as the Black Farmers Lawsuit is actually called Pigford versus Glickman, one of the largest class action lawsuits filed on behalf of black farmers against the USDA and the federal government.
There's a wide disparity in the way the Department of Agriculture treats black farmers versus white farmers.
Because of the practice, the discriminatory practices of USDA, I was put out of business. My family was destroyed, and basically they've just destroyed my life.
The Scots become one of the marquee families in this lawsuit.
Okay, this is just where we were working on the lawsuit, and I had to go back and show where my daddy had taken out promissory notes with USDA as the backer. I tried to keep everything I could.
Now, the government, the U.S. Department of Agriculture in this case, admits they discriminated against black farmers, unfairly denying them federal loans, for instance.
I'm very pleased that the judge approved the settlement so that we can begin to process these cases and black farmers can begin to receive their long overdue settlements.
The federal government paid out just north of $2 billion, and upwards of 70,000 successful claims were made by black farmers in the South. The Scotts received one of the largest settlements out of this lawsuit because, unlike lots of people, they had the documents to show exactly the ways in which the federal government discriminated against them. Most farmers were lucky to get $20,000.
Do you feel comfortable saying how much you guys got from USDA?
I'll give you an exact figure later, but it was right a little over $7 million. He was blind, but we made sure that he signed the documents to buy his land back, and he presented the check to the same man who was instrumental in taking his land. He was still in office.
It took the Scott family nearly 30 years, a space of a generation, to buy their land back. Land hunger, as W.E.B. Du Bois describes it, is this almost mystical drive to seek and to own something in this United States among people who were once property themselves. If you look at the Scotts, you look at what the land meant to them. It wasn't just money. It was destiny. It was something to hold on to. It was a purpose and something that held their family together through generations.
It grieves me that we were denied a history, and that's how I see it. And I'm gonna try not to cry. It's dear to me that my children know what my ancestors went through for us to be where we are and who we are. And for my dad, having the land and keeping the land, that was his dream. That was the heritage. The land was the heritage.
Family, we definitely have to have some unity. We have to unite. We have to have a large piece of land. We have to keep the black family together. We have to uplift our children. And we have to find industries and produce products and services where we can employ our youth and feed our families. It is obvious there's a reason why land and ownership of it has been dropped off of the reparations conversation, because they don't want us to think like that. They want us ushered into these cities and then look out here looking for jobs. We have to go back to the land. We have to go back to a pastoral way of life so that we can get away from the entrapments that they have out in society. So I think this definitely moved me to see that we definitely need to have unity and get back to the land, because it's definitely the source from which we come and the only thing which can sustain us. Because look at the brother in the story and the wealth he was able to generate for his family because of the amount of land that they owned. So land can generate wealth. So getting land in large quantity is definitely a factor, but also cultural unity as well, cultural continuity, seeing each other as brothers, seeing one another as the same, wanting the same for each other, and knowing that there is hostility around us, other groups of people that are working against us, that want to see us fail. Be honest with ourselves about the environment in which surrounds us. Brother John Henrik Clarke is going to clean the game up on that point.
I was supposed to be here early. They gave me another assignment. They didn't pick me up to go to the assignment. I followed their instructions and waited at the hotel. I would love to be here when I can be more fully in depth on this subject, because there's a whole lot of illusions about Africa's relationship with other people in the world. There's a whole lot of illusion about our relationship to the religions in the world. And these belief systems that had its origin in Africa, all of them, and there is no exception, turned on African people. I said there is no exception. And there's one thing you have to get through your mind and keep it. Nothing that ever came from the European mind was meant to do anything but facilitate European domination of the world. And I said there's no exception. Everything that was brought into this continent, everything, every idea, every so-called religion was meant to dominate and to control. The Arabs had no illusions about it. The Europeans had no illusions about it. You were the ones with the illusions. And yet every element that went into the making of every major religion in the world started in Africa. Why is it that you are so naive? You let people redress something that you invented, sell it back to you, and enslave you through it. I'm saying that all organized present religions are male chauvinist murder cults. And I say there is no exception. Why I wanted to be here earlier, I wanted to deal with our relationship with the people of the world and the fact that we created peaceful nations that had no word for jail because no one had ever gone to one. No word for old people's home because no one ever threw them away, grandma and grandpa. No word for orphanages. We did all of this, and over half of human civilization was over before we knew that a European was in the world. Before he wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window. Now Africa has always and still is the prize for the whole world. We as a people have always been the world's richest people, culturally rich, mineral rich. We have always been the prize because we have always had and still have something that other people won't, think they can't do without, and don't care to pay for. Because we have always been the prize, we have been under siege for over 3,000 years. Nothing that ever brought into Africa from the outside was meant to do the African any good. That means all other religions. Islam was the handmaiden of Arab imperialism. Christianity was the handmaiden of European imperialism. The Hebrew faith was the handmaiden of a concept called the chosen people. Now, if God is kind and God is merciful and God has no stepchildren, he won't choose one over the other. And to say he chose some people, you're making him a bigot. And to say that he endorsed enslavement of one people over the other, you're making him an accessory to murder. The Arabs used Islam to rationalize their slavery and their imperialism. The Europeans used Christianity to rationalize their slavery and imperialism. Who are you kidding about friends in the world? Damn it, if you want a friend, look in the mirror. There's 1 billion African people on the face of this earth. Why are you buying third-rate junk from third-rate people thinking you can't make it? Why don't you at least make a safety pin to hold your child's diaper together? Teach. Who has programmed your mind into thinking you can't make a car? The first man that made a car, they had never seen one previously. The Japanese bought cars, bought locomotives, broke them down and studied them, and had a Japanese technician produce each piece, put it together, and had a much better train than the one they copied from. All knowledge in the world belongs to everybody in the world. Yes. Who has programmed our mind in assuming that we cannot run a nation and run it well? The main thing imperialism did, slavery and imperialism, that they removed African people from the respectful commentary of history. And they tell them something they are still telling them, and all of the organized religions are guilty of this. I favor none of it because Africa didn't need any of it. I'm saying that African belief systems, properly understood, is 10 times better than Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And better for the Africans. Now you might have some romance with one of these religions. I have no romance with any of them. I have a romance with reality and truth. And the chips can fall where they may after I tell it. As for friends, you have had no friends. When they discovered you, they began to prey on you. Now let's look at our relationship with Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East. For 3,000 years, our greatest enemies came from Western Asia. They were trying to avenge the fact that they were once African colonies. You read a book called When Egypt Ruled the East, and you get some of the basic information on this. Now, the first visitors to Africa came in the 1700s BC. These were the people who would later be called Hebrews. Now, black people are ticklish on this because black people think that everything in the Bible is true. I question the intelligence of anyone who thinks everything in the Bible is true or supposed to be true. It's allegory, stories told to illustrate a point at a time when there were very few people reading books. And most of what went into the making of the Bible was copied from Egyptian texts. Now, if you want to get so dewy-eyed over the Bible, which is a carbon copy of a carbon copy, why don't you go back and read the original Egyptian text? Then you see where all these stories started from. You see where the story of the Exodus started from. Now, you get so dewy-eyed, you actually think there was an Exodus. These people walked into Africa. Why couldn't they walk out? Why did they have to go by sea? Nope. Why did they see at the park? If you read Egyptian literature, you will discover that the whole story of somebody parting the sea started with about 3,000 years before the Hebrew entrance. I should not use the word Hebrew entrance, but the entrance from Western Asia. Now let's get one thing straight, because black people are confused about all religions. Now I'm not against any religion. I'm a very spiritual human being. I just don't need a preacher to preach no 10 Commandments to me when he's a backslider going with some sister, some other man's wife. I'm intelligent enough to pick from the 10th commandment, not commandments anyway, but they were omissions of purity at the great school at Luxor, the great African training school. All right, now, let's get into this Western Asia. I'm saying that the people who came from Western Asia escaping famine did not have any Hebrew faith when they came into Africa. And there's no record of a Hebrew faith before there. Why is it that when they left Africa in the so-called Exodus, they had all three? African culture, an African religion, and an African language. Now look at the origin of the so-called people you now refer to as Jews. And you're mistaken using that reference because the word Jew is of European origin. And the people in Europe who call themselves by their name have no relationship to the biblical people of the Hebrew faith. And I'm saying that the people we now call Jews entered world history with their visit to Africa. And when Africa was invaded, 1675 BC, instead of joining the Africans who had been their beneficiary and saved them from starvation, they joined the enemies of Africa. No one has ever returned any favors to us. As a people, we have always been hospitable to strangers, mostly the wrong strangers. And what we have to understand now, in the period of superior brainwashing, is there is no European answer for African problems. Either Africans find a solution to African problems, or there is no solution, and if you don't find a solution soon, you go back into slavery. We have to stop all of this nonsense about who belongs to what religion when all of them were imposed on us in the first place. We stop all this fight between Muslims and Christians when neither one of the religions are doing them any good or moving them toward independence. All of them are handmaids of conquerors. All of them are religions of conquerors. We were naive when we accepted their interpretation of something that we had all along. I'm saying we need to take a good look at ourselves. I'm not talking about burning churches. I'm not talking about getting rid of religions. Understand me well. I am saying that every single thing that touches your life, religious, socially, and politically, must be an instrument of your liberation, or you must throw it into the ash can of history. Develop a liberation Islam. Yes. And if you develop a liberation Islam, you have to turn on the supreme slave traders who were in the slave trade 1,000 years before the Europeans, the Arabs. Yes. And most brothers who think they're Muslims are merely Arabists. Forerunners, vanguards of Arab propaganda. The Arabs are not above joining the Jews against black people. In America, they're already doing it in Detroit. In America, they're already doing it in real estate. You got some dewy-eyed thing that you got a friend. I still ask you to look at that mirror. And if nothing staring back at you is friendly, then you've got no friend. But this is why you start friends. All right. I'm saying something which you need to reconsider. I'm saying that everything that came into Africa, every people that came into Africa, did not come to do Africa any good. Everyone and every religion and every people who came into Africa declared war on African cultures. They began the bastardization of African people, created confused mulatto who didn't know whether he to be loyal to his mother's people or his father's people. That confusion is still here. The fascination for the color of the conqueror and the fascination to go to bed with the conqueror. Now that's raw and mean, but it's true. Now, some time ago, a North African leader, Gaddafi, was sending some Libyans to study in Europe. And he told them what any good nationalist would tell students going to study: I'm not sending you to Europe to find a wife. I'm sending you to Europe to gain the technology to come back and make Libya a strong nation, a strong Islamic nation, and a strong Arab nation. And you cannot achieve any of this between the legs of a European woman. When is somebody going to get strong enough to tell Africans going to school, you're going to come back home and pair up with a sister. But if you want to pair up over there, stay over there. Now, the one thing we have to look at, and I'm sorry, I'm going to have to conclude on this because I've left out a body of information. At the university, I teach an entire course, semester course, on Africa's relationship to other people. And I devote several semesters to Africa before Europe, the consequences of the coming of the Greeks, who stole a lot that they think is their culture, stole a lot that you think is Greek philosophy. We've been the victims of propaganda. And yet, if you read the Journal of African Civilization, other works, we have lived in Europe, we've lived in Asia, we've lived in the Americas. The African people have already proved that they can get along with different people, amalgamate their culture with different people without one hint of a war between us. People who come into Africa immediately declare war on African culture, standards of beauty, standards of conduct, and change the African concept of theirs so they can rule through him. This was true of the Greeks, who began the bastardization, again, the European bastardization of Africa. The Western Asians had begun it 3,000 years before that. The Romans, a bunch of well-dressed thugs who could write well but couldn't think, who borrowed practically everything. They laughed at the Africans' concept of Christianity. The African was practicing and not giving it a name. This is why you don't know nothing about the African origins of Christianity. This is why a whole lot of people will not read Ben Yakinen's The African Origins of the Major Western Religions, Africa, Mother of Western Civilization, a Black Man of the Nile. Because he's telling it like it is, but you also will not read white radicals who identified Africa as the origin of the great religions of the world, especially Alvin Boyd Kuhn in his work, Who is This King of Glory? And Shadow of the 3rd Century. We have dealt with John Jackson, another radical black historian, like Man, God, and Civilization. We let some of our great scholars die in hunger, die wanting for friendship. Now, having devoted my greater portion of my life to scholarship and teaching and digging up information on African people and trying to make African people face reality, I have often said, a point that I wish you to consider, I didn't have to do it. I chose to do it. And if I had to do it over again, I would do it better. But I have a lot of talent other than the talent to teach and to research. I've never met a rich man who had a better mind than me. So if I wanted to succeed as a rich man, I could have done that. I never met a crook who wasn't a fool. I could have been a good crook if I chose to be a crook. I chose to be a teacher of African history. I chose to look in the Bible where I couldn't find my people. I started looking for them in the world, and I didn't stop until I found them. And I know why they are left out of the Bible. I know why all the angels are white. You mean to tell me God is merciful, God is kind, and not one little brown or black angel sneaked into heaven? I ain't buying that. Now the Bible that you get so dewy-eyed over is one of the greatest pieces of propaganda ever written. If you want to read the Bible, why don't you read the Bible one day and read Mein Kampf the next day and see the comparison? That's hard on your mind. Because you think if you don't have Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, you don't have to have spirituality. I've got more spirituality after I put all of them down. And I've got more religion after I put all of them down. All right, now let me conclude something that has no conclusion. We have to look at the impact of Europeans on Africa. All impacts have been negative. The Romans laughed at the early African Christians. Finally, for political reasons, they stopped killing Christians and became Christians. I'm saying the Europeans became Christians for political reasons, as the Arabs became Muslim for political reasons, and as the so-called Jews became Hebrews for political reasons. People use organizations for political reasons, and what we get so dewy-eyed and think we're dealing with the truth. If you look at indigenous African belief systems, if you look at the idea when Africans had no churches of any consequence because these fools came here and said, this is the house of God, and the African looked at that church and said, if God who made the wind, the spring, made the ocean roar, and you're going to tell me he can fit into a little thing you call a church? That is no house of God. So some Africans had the common sense enough to move away from it, and some had the common sense to burn it down. I'm saying that you're closer to God when the further away you get away from organized religions that are all handmaidens of conquest. The Roman Empire developed during the early period of Christianity. Remember, the Roman Empire started in Africa. It rose in Africa. It fell in Africa. A lot of people need to stop reading some religious books and read some straight history without fable, without supposition, without myth. Read straight history. Read the Mediterranean world in ancient times. She's a racist bigot, but her chronology is good. And there's a good history of the European trying to move out of Europe into the Mediterranean to find something to eat, to put on that gosh darn awful European food. He has solved his problem at the expense of other people. The slave trade liberated Europe from the depressed economy they had created with the so-called Crusades and through the famines and the plagues. Europe always solves its problems by preying on people outside of Europe. They are in a position right now that they have betrayed true socialism, which was not of European origin in the first place. And some people are confused between Karl Marx and Groucho Marx. I think a lot of people are Groucho Marxism instead of Karl Marxism. They're funny people. And if you think that that system started in Europe, no system as humane as socialism could have started among a bunch of icebox people who prey on their brother for their breakfast. Read Kwame Colson's work, The History of the Modern World, especially the early chapters. Now, the evidence of Africans in the New World, the evidence of 1,000 years of civilization before slavery, all of this I'm not discussing because there is no time. But when the Romans disgraced themselves in the mismanagement of Christianity, they created a vacuum. Islam moved into that vacuum. The Africans thought that Islam would get the Romans off of their back. They were right. Islam got the Romans off of their back, and the Arabs jumped on their back, and they're still there, using Islam to justify it. Now, the African military man, because we are the greatest fighting machine in the face of the earth, if we ever discovered this, people are going to start running. Under proper leadership, proper inspiration, properly equipped, the black man is the greatest human fighting machine God ever created, if indeed God created it. I think the gods of Africa created it. Once you lose track of your heritage, you lose track of your liberty in this world. The Europeans doing the slave trade not only read the African out of history, they colonized history, they colonized information about history, they colonized image, they colonized the image of God. Who told you Christ was white? He was born in that part of the world predominantly occupied by non-European people. So you should not get into the argument about whether he's white. All you have to say, was he a Greek? No. Was he a Roman? No. But these were the only people partially white in the area at the time. If he wasn't a Greek, he wasn't a Roman, he was one of those other people. You don't have to argue about the shades of color. So far as you're concerned, once you establish he was not a woman, he was not a Greek, your conversation is over. Now, if somebody else want to argue about his shade, well, that's their problem. Then if you got a problem with color, then you got a problem with your mother and your father. You have insulted your mother and your father if you don't like what they gave you. I wear mine like a badge of honor. I dig it. I wear it well.
All right. Love it.
I'm saying in closing, and I am closing, that what you have to do is take a holistic look. Not only at your position in the world, but your potential in the world. You have to learn how to convert everything into an instrument of liberation or leave it alone. You have to realize there was no Greek fraternities and sororities until they were introduced to secret African societies. People get all dewy-eyed over something that was imposed on them in order to control them without understanding that. That's another imperial effort. So it bothers me, and although I have good personal friends who are Muslim, that not a single Muslim scholar have dealt with that 1,000 years of African independence before slavery and how the Arabs from the north systematically destroyed these nations. It did not occur. 1591, from Morocco, an army was launched against these great independent nations in inner West Africa. These were great states. And because of poor communication between African and African, there was enough armies in these states to march down to the coast and to drive every slave trader into the sea. But the communication between African and Africa was so poor. Even today, the East Africa is not too clear about what's happening in West Africa. And nobody knows what's happening in North Africa because the conspiracy to hold on to Africa is happening in South Africa and in North Africa. So the whites in South Africa willing to play a part, and the pseudo-whites in North Africa willing to play a part. In all this world, you have no friends. But if there are a billion of you on the face of this earth scattered all over the world, what do you need with a friend other than yourself? Why can't you turn inward on yourself and say, I will wear no clothes I don't produce. Start with your underwear. I wear no shoes that's not made by a brother. You're creating a shoe factory, employment at once. Start buying aeroplanes, break them down and study them, later on make aeroplanes. What this whole thing is about is the restoration of confidence. It has been the role of these handmaidens of colonialism to destroy your confidence in yourself. You don't believe that you can look like a god. You don't believe a black father in your home is to some extent a god. That doesn't make the black woman less than a goddess, because we produced the first human societies that recognized and respected the female god. We produced the first human society that said you can't be a king unless you got a queen. You can't be a god unless you got a goddess. So you can see All of these social ills that people are defending now, none of it started in our countries. I defy anyone alive, and those who want to come alive, come back and prove me, I invite them too, to show me one single case of sexual deviance or maladjustment any place on the African continent before the coming of foreigners. I defy you to show me one case of teenage pregnancy, one case of ill treatment of women. We got confused with someone else's ideas, someone else's concept and definition of us. What we have to understand is that faith has not spared us for an idle reason. A whole lot of people who've been hit less than us are extinct. What is there in us that made us strong enough to take this heavy blow? 500 years of slavery, one way or the other. Slavery, neo-colonialism. What made us strong enough to survive? What is faith saved us to do? And inasmuch as we gave the world its first humanity, faith has saved us to give the world its last humanity. What we have to do is to believe it, to believe that we are worthy of it, and to believe that we are capable of it. What black studies should be about, what black religion should be about, is the restoration of the confidence. And the restoration of the confidence is we must rule the state again. There is not an imitation nation, not an independent nation in Africa or the Caribbean islands. They're all imitation European states. And what we have to understand is that the nation state is stagnant. The African did not live in a nation state, he lived in a territorial state. The African learned something that's very basic. Cultures have to be fertilized by cultures. People have to be fertilized by the interaction between cultures and cultures. This insecure European tightened his borders. You know, you got a passport to come here? The word passport is not in any African language. The things he invented to restrict himself, he imposed on other people. Once we gain confidence in ourselves, and once we look at that person staring back at us from that mirror and like what we see, and don't move from that mirror until you like what you see. Then, in coordination with other African people throughout the world, we will give the world a new lease on life. We will turn to all of our people and not one part of them, because we came from a matrilineal society that respected women to the point the lineage came down to the female side. We must answer the call of the great African-American poet, Margaret Walker, who said, "Let the dirges end, let a new peace begin. Let us write a new covenant for the freedom of ourselves in the world." African men throughout the world need to step forward and answer Sister Margaret and say, "Sister Margaret, we have heard your call, and because we have never been a society that excluded women, with our women at our side, we are ready to pick up the challenge. We are ready to start a revolution that will change the world. We won't get ready tomorrow because tomorrow's things are left to tomorrow. We will start our revolution right now, and we will start it with ourselves." Thank you.
Thank you, Melanated family, for tuning in. We definitely need to turn the attention to ourselves and look at other brothers and sisters. And we need to create an economic cooperative so we can make a change for our own people in our own communities. One love, family. Catch you on the next video. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. One love.